like you. Be strong to hold the powers of the sun. To dream, believe in strength. Now I'm the only one.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Na Diorpop. In a world that never stops watching, sometimes the most meaningful moments are the ones that happen quietly, between laughter, teasing, and a single familiar name called with affection. Today, we're not talking about grand stages or flawless performances. We're talking about an airport moment. One scream of Jiminshi. One laugh that slipped out without restraint. And the kind of bond that shows itself in the smallest, most genuine ways. Let's talk about Jungkook and Jimin. And the teasing that meant more than it seemed. The airport that morning was filled with overlapping sounds. Flight announcements echoing through the halls, hurried footsteps, camera shutters clicking nonstop, and voices calling out names with pure, unfiltered affection. In the middle of it all, Jimin walked with his shoulders slightly raised, his cap pulled low, yet his smile still found its way through. He was used to this by now. Used to being loved loudly. Used to hearing his name called as if it meant everything. Then one voice stood out. Jiminshi I. It was high-pitched, enthusiastic, almost cracking with emotion. So sincere that Jimin instinctively turned his head. For a brief second, just a heartbeat, he smiled and nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement, a silent thank you to the stranger who had called his name with so much heart. The moment passed quickly, almost too fast for cameras to catch. But Jungkook noticed. He always did. He caught the subtle shift in Jimin's expression, the way the corners of his lips lifted just a little higher than usual, the way his eyes curved with a smile that wasn't planned, but felt. Jungkook, who had always been attuned to Jimin's smallest changes, stored that moment away. Not to keep it to himself, but to play with it. A few steps later, as they continued walking side by side, Jungkook suddenly leaned in slightly, tilting his head toward Jimin. Then, with exaggerated enthusiasm, he recreated the sound. Jiminshi I. His voice was intentionally dramatic. A little higher. A little louder. Exactly like an overexcited fanboy who couldn't believe his idol was right there. No warning. No build-up. Jimin froze for half a second. Then he burst out laughing. Not a polite laugh. Not the reserved smile he often showed in front of cameras. But a genuine, unfiltered laugh, one that made his shoulders shake and his head dip forward. His hand flew up instinctively, half covering his face, as if he wanted to hide from the sweet embarrassment flooding over him. "Hey," he protested between laughs, already defeated. "Why are you like this?" Jungkook just grinned. Right. Completely satisfied. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes sparkled with triumph, the unmistakable look of someone who had achieved exactly what they wanted. And that was the point. It wasn't about the scream itself. It wasn't about the joke, or the imitation, or how silly it sounded. It was about the intention behind it. Jungkook did it for one simple reason, to make Jimin laugh. In the middle of tight schedules, relentless cameras, and a world that constantly demanded perfection, Jungkook chose to be ridiculous. He chose to echo a fan's scream, not to mock it, but to preserve that tiny moment that had almost slipped away. Jimin lifted his head again, eyes still smiling, cheeks faintly flushed. He glanced at Jungkook from under his fringe, his expression caught somewhere between embarrassment, fondness, and something warmer, something he didn't bother naming. "You really are," Jimin started, then let the sentence fade. Jungkook shrugged, pretending innocence. But his smile told the rest of the story. They kept walking as they always did, side by side. Yet something in the air had shifted. Something subtle, invisible to most cameras, but unmistakable to anyone who knew where to look. Jimin's laughter lingered at the edges of his lips. And Jungkook, without realizing it, walked just a little closer than before. To fans, it might have looked like nothing more than playful teasing. A funny airport moment. A short clip destined to be replayed endlessly with crying emojis in the caption. But for Jimin and Jungkook, it was their own language. One that didn't need explaining. Jungkook knew exactly which buttons to press to make Jimin forget his fatigue, even if only for a moment. And Jimin knew, without needing to ask, that behind the silly imitation was genuine care. A quiet desire to protect his smile. A few seconds later, Jungkook spoke again, this time softer, closer. Jiminshi, he said, teasing, but gentle. Jimin sighed, then laughed again, quieter now. He shook his head, but he didn't step away. He never did. And maybe that's what made this moment so unforgettable. In a world that constantly put them under bright lights, Jimin and Jungkook found ways to remain themselves, through small jokes, playful echoes, and smiles that only the two of them truly understood. One scream at an airport, one deliberate imitation, and two smiles that, without trying, said more than 1,000 words. As they moved farther down the terminal, the noise around them seemed to blur. The calls of fans, the flashing cameras, the constant motion, it was all still there, yet somehow distant. What lingered instead was the aftertaste of laughter. The kind that stays with you. The kind that warms your chest long after the sound fades. Jimin adjusted his mask, but his eyes betrayed him. They were still curved, still bright, still holding on to the amusement Jungkook had sparked so effortlessly. He tried to look forward, tried to regain his composure, but every time he did, he could feel Jungkook's presence beside him, too familiar to ignore. Jungkook, on the other hand, kept glancing sideways. Not obviously. Not enough for cameras to catch. Just quick looks. Just as if he needed to confirm that Jimin was still smiling. That the laugh hadn't disappeared the moment the joke ended. When he saw that it hadn't, when he saw Jimin's shoulders relaxed, his steps lighter, something soft settled in Jungkook's chest. Mission accomplished. Jungkook had always been like this. Loud in the way he teased, playful in the way he reached out, but careful, always careful, when it came to Jimin's heart. He never crossed lines. He only danced along the edges, close enough to make Jimin laugh, but gentle enough not to overwhelm him. Jimin finally looked back at him. It wasn't a long stare. Just a brief glance. But it carried weight. Gratitude, affection, trust, all wrapped into a single look that said, "I know why you did that." Jungkook met his eyes, and for a moment, his grin softened. The teasing sparkle faded into something quieter, warmer. He leaned in just enough for only Jimin to hear. "You laughed," he said, almost like an observation. Jimin huffed, amused. "Because you're embarrassing." "But you laughed," Jungkook repeated, softer this time. Jimin didn't argue. He didn't deny it. Instead, he nodded slightly, the smallest admission. And that was enough. There were many ways to show care in this world. Grand gestures, public declarations, dramatic moments frozen in time. But Jikook had always existed in the in-between. In echoes of fan screams. In stolen glances. In a voice raised just to hear a laugh in return. As they reached another stretch of the airport, Jimin slowed his pace unconsciously. Jungkook matched him without thinking. Their steps fell into rhythm, familiar and effortless, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. Jimin exhaled, long and quiet. "You know," he said casually, as if the thought had just crossed his mind, "you didn't have to do that." Jungkook tilted his head. "Do what?" "Make me laugh." Jungkook smiled, small this time. "Honest. I wanted to." Jimin's lips pressed together for a second, holding back another smile. He looked ahead again, but his ears turned red beneath his hair. Jungkook noticed. Of course he did. Around them, fans continued to cheer. Cameras continued to flash. But in that narrow space between their shoulders, there was something calmer. Safer. A shared bubble built from years of understanding without explanation. Jungkook hummed softly, then suddenly repeated it once more, barely above a whisper. "Jiminshi." This time, there was no exaggeration. No drama. Just warmth. Jimin laughed again, quieter than before, but deeper. He didn't cover his face this time. He didn't protest. He simply leaned slightly toward Jungkook as they walked, as if drawn by instinct rather than intention. And maybe that was the real story behind the clip fans would replay endlessly. Not the scream. Not the imitation. But the way Jungkook knew exactly how to reach Jimin. And the way Jimin always let him. In the end, it was never just teasing. It was care disguised as laughter, affection hidden in imitation, and love, soft, steady, and unmistakable, echoing through an airport full of noise. And in the end, it was never just about a scream in an airport. It was about knowing exactly how to make someone smile. About laughter that comes naturally, without effort or explanation. Between Jungkook's teasing and Jimin's laughter, we're reminded of this. Real bonds don't need to be loud. Sometimes, they simply echo in the quietest moments. Thank you for watching Na Diorpop. Until the next story, White Heart Sparkles.